at the temple, and we spent a lot of time showing how wonderful this temple was with all its gold. It was just a stunning building. And when Jesus says there's coming this day that not one stone's going to be left upon another, it's shocking to his disciples. They know that this translates into one thing and one thing only. The Jewish nation is coming to an end. It's over. And that's how shocking it is. So they ask, as a result of that, just two questions. When will this happen? And what will be the sign to show that it's going to happen? All right? And that's reasonable, right? Because if Jesus came and said the White House is going to be destroyed, the Capitol building and all that, wouldn't you want to know the same thing? When is this going to happen? And what are some signs we can look for that it's about to take place? So that's what he gives, is some early signs, and then he'll give us some information about the when, all right? So that's where we are last week. But I just want you to look with me in Deuteronomy 28, because to understand this context of the Mark 13 as well as Matthew 24, we have to understand a little bit about the bigger picture. And so hopefully this is a review for most of us. But we know that God made a promise to Abraham that he would create out of him a great nation through Isaac and through Jacob. And they did become a great nation, the nation of the Israelites, right? The Jews. Now, they went to Mount Sinai where God gave them the law, but they broke it immediately and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And then after they're ready then to go into the promised land, what does Moses do for him before he dies? Deuteronomy. Deuteros means what? Retold law. The second giving of the law. Mr. Cruz? Yep, all right. So he's repeating the law the second time because it's a whole new generation of people, right? But in that giving of the law, in chapter 28, where we are, he's saying, here's what's going to happen. There's blessings and curses attached. Blessings if you obey God, and curses if you don't. Now, they've experienced the curse already, the past generation. Everyone over the age 20 died in the wilderness. But he's saying there's coming a day where this whole nation's going to come to an end. So on our timeline, that's where we are on the cross of Jesus. He's talking right here in Mark chapter 13. He's saying it's just about ready to happen. And we know that it actually did happen in 70 AD, okay? So real quickly, we won't read the whole chapter, but I would invite you to do so of Deuteronomy 28, excuse me, because some of the language is, well, look in verse 2. We'll just cruise through it. It said, all these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. You see that? Then in verse 15, I'm in Deuteronomy 28, 15. It shall come about if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe, to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I charge you today. Then all these curses will come upon you. And he starts listing them. But there's always this promise that as soon as you repent, I'll restore the blessings. Now, that's the book of Judges, right? And they went through a cycle of prosperity, disobeying God. Then they had all sorts of problems. They repented, and God restored blessings. And then after prosperity, they got lackadaisical and apathetic, and they sinned, and then the same cycle repeated. There's going to come a time where God says, that's it. That's it. The cup of iniquity is full. Now, isn't that what Jesus said? All the guilt of all of your forefathers are going to fall upon this generation because they actually killed the last prophet, Jesus himself. So he alludes to this final event. Notice verse 45. Then all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you have would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments. And this shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever, because you did not serve the Lord your God. That's in verse 47. 48, you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst and nakedness. Verse 49, here it is. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the ends of the earth, as an eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you will not understand. We know the emblem of the Roman army was the eagle, okay? A nation of fierce countenance, who will have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd, the produce of the ground. In other words, it's going to totally devastate your country. There won't be any food left, and there'll be a famine and starvation like you've never seen. See at the end of verse 52, it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land. Verse 53, so you're going to eat the offspring of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord God has given you during the siege, and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you. Isn't that gruesome? You're so hungry, you're eating your own children. I don't know if they were miscarried or you killed them. It doesn't say, right? The man who is refined, verse 54, and delicate among you shall be hostile toward his brother, toward his wife he cherishes. In other words, where they used to share, now they're going to be greedy and killing and robbing, all right? He talks about verse 56 and verse 57. The woman's even eating the afterbirth of her child because they're so starving so terribly. And why? Why is the case? Look at verse 64. The Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other, the end of the earth, and there you shall serve the gods, other gods of wood and stone which you have not known. And well, why? Because, look in chapter 29. Verse 24, the nations will say, why has the Lord done this? Why this great outburst of anger? And the men will say, because they forsook the covenant of the Lord their God, their Father, which he made with them. And they went, in verse 26, worshiped other gods and served them. So, do you understand? God promised 1,000 years before it happened that this destruction would end come because they would not be faithful to him. So when we look at Mark 13, that's what Jesus is talking about, what God promised a long time ago. Does that all make sense, the context? So that hopefully is going to help us when we look at some of this prophetic language, because it's so easy to take prophetic language and say, well, it says this, let's make it literal. Well, consider this in Hosea 11. When Israel was a youth, speaking of the nation of Israel, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, what is that referring to? The Exodus. They were in Egyptian captivity. God called them out of Egypt, and that's how they became the Son of God, the children of God, right? They were this mighty nation, but they were in captivity. Now, that same passage is used of Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. He remained there. That's when they had to flee to Egypt, Joseph and Mary, because Herod's going to have all the babies under 2 killed. And so he stayed there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, when you look at that in Hosea 11, I challenge you to look at it, do you see anything in reference to Jesus? How do you know it's prophetic? Because the Lord tells us it was in Matthew 2. Do you understand what I'm saying? And where you make a literal application of Egypt, spiritually it's talking about how Jesus had to flee to Egypt and he was called out himself. There's no coincidences in the Bible. And so we don't take everything literal, and we have to do some background study when we look at this language. And that's why you hear these words like eschatology or apocalyptic language or the end times. People really don't know how to understand Bible prophecy, but we let the Bible explain itself, and that's what we're going to try to do. So, we saw the early birth pangs. Remember, there'll be wars and earthquakes and all these issues coming up, and he just said that's just the beginning, but it's not the end. But now we see in chapter 13, we're in verse 14, he says, but. Now that's the transition. I'm sorry?
But or so.
Yours says so? Okay. But, verse 14, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Is that in italics or in parentheses? Then let those who are in Judea flee the mountain. And let him who is on the housetop not go down or enter in to get anything out of his house. And let him in the field not turn back to get his cloak. And woe to those who are with child and those who nurse babes in those days. But pray that it may not happen in the winter. For those days will be a time of tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created, until now, and never shall. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And if anyone says to you, behold, there's the Christ, behold, he is there, don't believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders, if order impossible to lead the elect astray. But take heed, behold, I've told you everything in advance. But in those days, after that, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, verse 25, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and gather together the elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. And then he's going to give a parable. Now, if you read that, what does that sound like if you just read it? The end of the world, doesn't it? And that's why most people that talk about Matthew 24 or Mark 13 say this is the end of the world. Jesus coming on the clouds, the sun being darkened, the moon's falling, those things like that. But we're going to suggest to you that if you look in the context again, Jesus said there's coming a day that not one stone of the temple will be standing, not the earth. They asked the question, when will this be? And later we're going to read the end of the chapter. He said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So somehow we got to get the Son of Man coming in the clouds, the sun darkened, the moon, and then the stars falling, all happening when? When do we have to have those happening? At the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, we have to make sense of that. Do you understand our challenge? Did Jesus come on the clouds? Here he said he did, all right? So let's go through, hope you understand what we're dealing with now, and we'll look at this. First of all, this abomination of desolation. Jesus gives us a clue when he says what? Let the reader understand. Now, if he's talking to Jewish people or Hebrews, what have they been reading in the synagogue every day? The old law and the prophets. Now, in Matthew's account, he adds a little more. Therefore, when you see the abomination, desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel, oh, that's where the reader's supposed to find his understanding. When he was spoken of Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, that's the place where he should not be. So someone's going to come and stand right where? In the temple, okay? And again, he says, let the reader understand. So we know then that we have to go back to the book of Daniel. Now, it's found two places, this phrase, abomination and desolation. The first one is in chapter 9, verse 27, speaking of the coming destruction of Jerusalem, that when on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. So that's why he's the abomination of desolation. He's abominable because who's the only one that could go into the holy temple? A priest. Could a Gentile ever enter there? Because they would make it unclean and it would be an abomination. So anyone other than a Jewish priest walking in the temple would be an abomination, but this guy doesn't care because what's he coming to do? Destroy Jerusalem. So when he stands in the temple, he's standing to make it desolate. And they go, oh yeah, I always wondered what that meant in Daniel chapter 9. Okay, this is the one that is decreed. He's poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now, the other place is in chapter 11, and we could study Daniel, but I'm just referring you back to it, that forces will rise and desecrate the sanctuary. That's the what? What's the sanctuary? The temple, and do away with regular sacrifice. What's that a reference to? You know, on the altar, they were sacrificing every day. For sacrifice to end, what has to end as well? The temple and the whole system of Jewish worship. This will happen, and they're going to set up the abomination of desolation. So they understood the day was coming when, whether they understood when or how or why, that the temple was going to be destroyed and there's going to be an end of sacrifice. So when we see this, we find this phrase, when you see the abomination standing where it should not be, that's in the temple. It's the destroyer. In fact, Luke says this way, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize that her desolation is at hand. So what happened? In 70 A.D., Titus finally came, he turned and he surrounded the city, because often when you have a walled city, you had a choice of trying to break the walls down and or else surround it and starve it out. Now, you wouldn't want to try to attack the city when it's walled and fortified, because you'd have a great loss of your own life, of your own soldiers. So it's easier just to put a perimeter around it and just starve them out. Now, they had a huge water supply in Jerusalem. They stored up all their food. And, of course, they thought they would never be destroyed because the temple, God's with them. Now, we studied last week, no, God already left the temple. He's not left with them. They're on their own. So Titus offered 2 or 3 times terms of peace. Just surrender and we won't kill you. And they go, no, our God, the temple, will prevail. And so for 6 to 7 months, they were starved out. And it got so bad when they finally broke in the walls and took their standard and stood in the temple with this standard, the Roman standard with the eagle on it. They found bodies literally piled in the street, and women's with having their babies in their ovens cooking. And that's what Josephus writes. It's horrific. But the fulfillment of everything Deuteronomy said, the delicate person was no longer delicate. Okay? And so that's what happened when it was Rome that surrounded them and ended up bringing about their destruction. That's just a matter of history. Now, Luke 19 says this, the days will come when your enemies will barricade you around and hem you in on every side. That describes what? The siege of Jerusalem. This is before it actually happened. They will level you to the ground, and you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. What's that last phrase a reference to? Jesus coming to save them. And they rather than accept his salvation, what did they do? They killed him, all right? And so that's why all the guilt's falling upon the Jews of that generation. Does that make sense, what we're dealing with? So what is the abomination of desolation? What is it? The Roman army. It's Rome itself. Okay? Now, wait a second. Didn't Deuteronomy say that? God said, I'll raise up a nation from afar, a fierce nation. But later we're going to have to explain Jesus is the one coming on the clouds. I thought Rome came, but it says Jesus is coming. See, still we have a challenge. We have to work that out, okay? So let's go on, though, in the text that we read. When you see the army surround Jerusalem, what does verse 14 say? Get out of town as fast as you can. Flee to the mountains. If you're on the housetop, don't go down and get something and pack your stuff. It'll be too late. And if you're out in the field, you're working the ground, you don't go back in to go get your coat. Now, this is an obvious answer, but I got asked the question. If this is talking about the end of the world, where God's going to come to destroy the whole heavens and the earth, what good would it do to flee to the mountains? None. I mean, you're going to find your destruction there as well, wouldn't you? There's no value in running to the mountains if this was the end of the world. Does that make sense? So obviously, it cannot be talking about the end of the world. Obviously, it's something about the destruction of Jerusalem. But Christians understood this message because they trusted what Jesus was saying. The Jews as a whole rejected it. So Josephus writes and others that when Rome surrounded Jerusalem, the Christians realized, hey, it's over, let's get out. And they all got out of Jerusalem. Now they say not a Christian perished. Now could there be exception to that? I don't know. But overall, the Christians escaped this judgment because they understood the warnings and they got out of town. Now that's amazing, you know, but the same thing's true to us. Is God coming again the second time? Can we escape that judgment? No. Yes, we can. Well, yeah. The second one as well, if we'll just heed the warning. That's right. Just heed the warning and be ready. Okay? So, does that make sense? Don't go back into this city, all right? And so he says it's going to get so bad, this siege of Jerusalem, he says we're going to call it the Great Tribulation. Now, when you hear the Great Tribulation, people still apply that to the future. You know, the battle of Magog and Gog and Antichrist and all these things going on. But he's saying it's going to happen right then. But notice some of the characteristics of this tribulation. First of all, if you're pregnant, you're going to be really in a hardship. Why? If you're running to the mountains, that's not going to be easy, okay? If it's winter, would you like that? No, pray that it's not in the winter, because that's going to make it hard, because it's cold. It does snow in Jerusalem, all right? There's some of the verses I shared with you earlier. But he says, the days of those tribulation have not occurred since the beginning of creation. So up until this time, the destruction of Jerusalem, has this been the worst tribulation that has ever been seen? It seems that's what he's saying, right? Not only that, there has, let me write. For these days will be a time of tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God has created until now, and never will. In other words, in the future, will there be one as great or greater than this one? No. This is the Great Tribulation. Now, why that's important, he goes on to say, if God didn't shorten the days, you know, everyone would have perished. Revelation chapter 7 talks about the Great Tribulation. And there's this great crowd, innumerable, before the throne of God. And one of the beings asked John, who is this crowd? And John says, I don't know, Lord, you tell me. And that's where in verse 14 it says, these are the ones that have come out of the Great Tribulation. How did they come out of the tribulation and get to heaven? By dying. Martyrs, that's right. But it's interesting, if this is the Great Tribulation, and it took place at the destruction of Jerusalem, and Revelation is talking about a Great Tribulation, do we have two Great Tribulations, or are they the same one? They're the same one. So when you're studying Revelation, now we have a time frame, a context, that has to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem as well. Or else we have two Great Tribulations, all right? There's just one, okay? So I just want to share that with you, okay? Notice what it said in Deuteronomy 28. Among those nations whom you'll find no rest. There'll be no resting place for the sole of your feet. The Lord will give you a trembling heart, the failing of eyes, the despair of soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. They'll be in dread day and night. You shall have no assurance of your life. In the morning you'd say, oh, if it was just evening, this day was over. When it's evening, you'd say, oh, it was just morning so we could have a new day. Can you see the total despair? All talking about this time of great tribulation.
You know, it's interesting when you look at what happened here. It's the same thing that happened destruction happened with the Chaldeans, they were taking passages, and people do today, from Nahum chapter 2 and verses 1 through 4, and they talk about those and say these are future events.
Mm-hmm.
What it's talking about is when you see these chariots in the street, they put it to cars.
Yeah.
They do all this misrepresent. This happened during that time.
Yeah.
And they want to place it still future.
That's right.
That's just not understanding the Word of God.
Well, that's right. So, and that's exactly. So, again, is everyone clear with what's going on here? All right, so let's move on. When we goes on to say there's going to be false Christ, we talked about that there in that time period there were people rising up, I am the Messiah, and Jesus saying, don't go, don't follow him. They'll even do false signs. Isn't that interesting? False miracles. Do people even claim that today? Do they? All right. But he said, I've told you everything in advance, so don't be a sucker and fall for him. Now, that was back then. It's still going on even today, all right? And then he says, here's the challenging one, all right? So we're going to slow down here. He says, in those days, what are those days? Help me. Tribulation. The city is what? Surrounded by an army. There's this great, famine going on and all these woes inside, and you're out running in the mountains. You've left your home and abandoned everything you know, but you're running for your lives. That's in those days. Okay? Now, what were the two questions the disciples asked? When will this happen, and what will be the signs? Now, he's been given signs. Now he's going to speak to what's going to happen or when it's going to happen. After those days, not the exact date, but in those days. So when you see the city surrounded and you're running, you know it's really close, okay? In those days, after that tribulation, the sun will go dark, and the moon will not shine, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Is that powers on the earth? No, it's powers in heaven, all right? So, what in the world does this mean? Because people want to argue that this is still talking about the end of our world. They'll say, none of that happened back then. And we're going to say, yes, it did, all right? So, remember, prophetic language, you don't always take it literally, all right? Do we speak metaphorically often in our life? Like, man, that was a dark day in my life. What do you mean? Oh, boy, it's like the sun didn't shine at all. Well, what do you mean? I said, don't you get it? You say, what? It's not literal. The sun, it shined that day, but in my life, it went dark, right? They use that kind of language throughout the Old Testament. And let's just look at one place, Isaiah 13, okay? This is all destruction language in the Bible. And the prophets used it figuratively to apply to the fall of a nation. And I'll just set some explanation to help you understand the context. Stars were often referred to as the leaders of a nation, the king, the noble ones. They were like the stars of that nation. And if you would talk about the stars falling, what would that mean? If a star represents the leaders or the kings. Well, if they're falling, what's happening? The whole nation's falling. So it's destruction or judgment language. Now, in Isaiah 13, my Bible, the publisher puts a summary of the paragraph on the top, the title. Does yours do that too? You don't know if you're not looking. What does it say, Eva? Oh, Isaiah 13? Yeah, verse 1. Who's there? What does it say? The doom of Babylon. Is that what yours says, Sally? Linda? The oracle concerning Babylon. All right, the prophecies against Babylon. So all the publishers that have translated the Bible and published about, they understand chapter 13 is talking about the end of Babylon. specifically Nebuchadnezzar, all right? So, look at the language that's going on here, okay? Verse 6, wail, for the day of the Lord is near. Actually, I should have started verse 1. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. He says it's against Babylon. Verse 6, the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. So when God decides that a nation is so utterly wicked that he's going to destroy it, we call that, or the Bible calls that, the day of the Lord. It's the great day of the Lord. And we think of the day of the Lord something come in the future. There's been many days of the Lord. Anytime God visits a nation, it's a day of the Lord, okay? And so that's what he's speaking of here. Verse 7, therefore all hands will fall, every man's heart will melt. They'll be terrified, pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor, and they'll look at one another in astonishment, and their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury, burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. This is pretty graphic or strong, isn't it? But notice verse 10. Now, what is chapter 13 about? Destruction of Babylon, okay? The great day of the Lord. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. See that language? And it's referring to the end of the world, our world? No, it's the end of Babylon. And again, it makes sense. Well, it makes nonsense if you take it literally. Okay? But it makes all the sense in the world when you understand this type of language. Stars and the moon, the sun, refer to the stars, the leaders of the land. And when you would besiege a nation, a city, and you'd burn it, there'd be so much black smoke. Would the sun darken? Yes. Would the moon not shine? Yes. And literally that could happen. So it became just the type of language you'd use. Hey, there's a dark day coming in your history when the sun won't shine on this country anymore. Whoa. See how it was a literally, because of the burning smoke, now it's just destructive or judgment language. That's all we have here. Yes?
That happened in Iraq when the oil fields were burning.
Yeah.
The daytime was completely like night.
Exactly.
You could not see.
I've heard that. That's right. All right. Verse 13, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place in the fury of the Lord in the day of his burning anger. Verse 17, lest you think this is still something about the future. Verse 17, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold. In other words, they won't be bribed. And they're going to come and destroy Babylon. Verse 19, in Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' prides will be as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, yes. Who had to? Oh, Ann, sorry. Yes.
Should we consider that the Great Tribulation applies to the greatest tribulation of the Israelite nation?
Or of all time?
Of all time, because I consider the Holocaust or the Gulag Archipelago.
Yes. I would understand in this context, concerning God and his people, it's the greatest of all time. Have there been tribulations and Holocaust? Yes. But this is even going to be against God's people, the elect. And I understand your question, and I think there's an argument you made it could go both ways. But when you specifically look at it, he's talking about his elect. If he didn't cut those days short, there won't be anyone to survive, but he does for the sake of the elect. They're the ones that are perishing terribly. I mean, Nero instituted a persecution against the Christians in this time frame, and they were murdered and burnt at a stake, and it was horrific. the amount of people, God's people that died during this time period. Not just in Jerusalem, I'm talking about all over. Right. So that's my understanding. It's the greatest ever for Christians. It's a tribulation for them. Not greatest tribulation in the world for people in general. So I think that's a clarification it's good to make. All right. So now, Isaiah, is that clear about Isaiah 13? So could Jesus use this language about Jerusalem? Certainly, the sun's going to be darkened. It's going to be a dark day in Jerusalem's history. The stars are going to fall. In other words, all its leaders are going to be brought down, destroyed, killed. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. You remember it said there'll be earthquakes and all that. It's interesting, the powers in heaven, I won't even go there. But there seems to be, Daniel, do this study, I'll just throw it out. Daniel says when one of the archangels came, he said, I would have been here sooner, but I was contending with the prince of Persia. There seem like there's angelic forces that are working with each nation, either evil ones or good ones. And sometimes that might be what this is a reference to. For when God takes down Jerusalem, he also contends with the forces, angelic forces that are working with Jerusalem in the terms of evil. You say, well, that's a whole other study. I'll just let you think about that one, do your own study, because it's very interesting, all right? Remember Ephesians 6, our struggle against what is really what it is against? But it's the spiritual powers in the heavenly places, not on earth. It's the spiritual powers in heaven, those forces. That's what we battle against. All right, so we have 5 minutes. Great. Here's the big one. Then they're going to see the Son of Man coming in clouds. So we explained how the stars got dark. They didn't literally get dark, did they? Just the leaders fell. How are we going to explain that Jesus came on the clouds in AD 70? Because if we're understanding correctly this, that's what it says is happening, correct? So there's two ways we can take this. Literally, oh, there's Jesus on the clouds. Or what? Figuratively, as, again, destruction or a judgment language. Now, which one do you think it would probably be, since we've seen figurative already? Now, it's interesting. When God brought up the Medo-Persian Empire, and they're the ones historically destroyed Babylon, and he named them before it ever happened in Isaiah 13. But it's called the great day of the Lord when he's doing the destroying. But who actually did the destroying? The Medo-Persian Empire, right? They conquered Babylon. Now I said, actually, who destroyed them? I'm going to ask, but who actually did destroy them? God did. So which was it? Was it God or the Medes?
God used the Medes for his judgment.
God was coming riding on the backs of the Medes. Because when you have a wicked nation and you want to destroy them, what do you need to destroy a wicked, evil, mean people? Someone that's meaner than the people you're trying to destroy or judge, right? Someone wicked and meaner. And then you'll deal with them later. And that's what he did. So here we have Jerusalem, who is evil. Not every last person, but at its core, it's evil. God said, that's it, I'm done. I'm coming. Who is he going to come to use to be his sword in his hand, his element of destruction? Rome. But who's doing the destroying? Jesus is. He said, you're going to see me coming on the clouds. In other words, when you come on the clouds, can you stop the rain clouds coming into the valley from the coast when they come? No. Can you stop the wind clouds, the storm clouds? No. When it comes, it's over. And that's what he's doing here. The Son of Man's coming on the clouds, and you're going to see him, and you're going to remember when you see the abomination and desolation, the Lord said he's coming. Look what he did. See what it's saying? Was it a literal coming on a cloud? No. Okay, I just have enough time, so hang on. This is, again, kingdom language. Notice in Revelation chapter 1, Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in Revelation. He said, behold, he's coming with the clouds, Every eye will see him. Notice this, even those who pierced him. Who would that be a reference to? The ones who what? The ones who actually crucified him and pierced him with a sword or spear. Who's going to see Jesus coming on the clouds? The very generation that yelled, crucify him. So you know this cannot be a literal coming, like Jesus on the clouds, but it's figurative speaking of him coming in judgment. Does that make sense? When you get that, oh yeah, that's easy then. Now that same language is used 3 other places in the Son of God, and what did he say? I am, and furthermore, you're going to see the Son of Man sitting on power when he comes in glory. And they said, you will see me coming on the clouds. And that's the idea of they're going to witness his destruction of Jerusalem. So either Jesus was lying or they saw him come. Which would you prefer? All right? They saw him come. Okay. So then as far as the times, we're going to pick that up next week because it's kind of a parable of the fig tree. What's up? Does God use nations to do his acts of judgment? Yes. That's right, always. When God chooses to judge a nation because their iniquity is full, is there any way that can be stopped? No. In this case, was the judgment on Israel deserving? Because their cup of iniquity was full. Did God, in the same time judging the evil, did he deliver his own people? Now, I want you to see this because there's going to be an interim period between 33 AD when the kingdom is established and when Jerusalem is destroyed. The Jews are saying what? We're God's kingdom. The Christians are saying, no, we are. And the Jews are destroying the Christians. They're losing this battle, being martyred right and left, the Great Tribulation. There's got to be an outcome. God's going to decide who his people are and show it once and and how does he show whose his people is or are? He destroys the oppressor, Jerusalem, who is oppressing and killing people. And when he destroys them, that sends a signal. They're done. These are my people, the church. Does that make sense? The destruction of Jerusalem is the end of the ministry of the gospel. You can't have the final chapter of the being fulfilled until you have Jerusalem destroyed. That's in Revelation as well. Yeah. Good point. Good. What did you want to say?
The Assyrians, they were more evil than the Assyrians and was able then to destroy Nineveh. But with that also, the Chaldeans never were clear of their guilt, and God also brought them to judgment. But it was all for delivering his people.
That's right. All right, good. All right, thank you. I hope if you agree that hell, the subject of hell, is probably one of the least talked about subjects in our pulpit here, at least at South Salem, but yet it's one of the most talked about subjects by Jesus Christ himself. There was a time when you had hellfire and brimstone in the United States, where people would talk about the brimstone that rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah and would shout and yell and warn that with the same thing is going to happen to us in an eternity burning in hell. And it's as though, as one man would say, I'd rather scare them into heaven than see them burn in hell. And it was all based on fear, intimidation, and yet it was very effective. Because in the Victorian days, where people had a strong sense of right and wrong, they believed in absolutes and they believed in being held accountable for their actions, that such a message was very sincere and real to them. And they wanted to avoid going to a place as terrible and as horrible as hell. But boy, things have changed, haven't they? We're in a society now where, it's about tolerance. It's about not judging others. It's about living your own life and finding your own personal truth. And the one word that would prevail overall is just love each other. And perhaps the biggest objection you'll hear to Christianity, second to how could a loving God allow people to suffer, is how could a loving God send people to hell to suffer forever? And that's a big concern a lot of people have. They don't understand it. And so, often the message of Christ has been, shall we say, toned down. And we don't talk so much about the judgment to come, as we just sang those wonderful songs, there's a great day coming. But we talk about the love of God, the love of Christ, and what he can do for your life, and how he can enhance your marriage and your walk on this earth. And while those are all true, they're secondary to what Jesus came for in the first place. He came to seek and to save the lost. So in this age of love and feel-good and political correctness, it's very seldom we hear a lesson about hell, and I'm at fault. I had to think back, when's the last time I devoted an entire lesson or a series to hell? And I cannot remember when I've done that here at South. And yet, if we understand the Bible, the large majority of people that have ever walked on this earth will find their place, their home, eternity, in this place that is called hell. And it's not because God is unloving. It's because you cannot talk about the salvation of God, which comes by his love, unless you talk about that which he is saving us from. And that only makes sense. And that's why, as Mevo read for us out of Romans chapter 2, behold the kindness and the severity of God. They go together like two sides of a coin. So we want to talk this morning just briefly, and I promise I won't yell at you. There won't be any fire and brimstone, because this subject is serious enough that if we take careful attention and listen to what God has said, the seriousness of the reality of hell should put the fear of hell in you by itself. We're going to give 4 reasons why we must talk about hell as a real place, because first of all, it is real. Second of all, it's a real place of torment. Thirdly, hell is a place of judgment of people's choices. Now, I'll explain that. But then finally, hell reveals God's love and our dignity. And without the preaching of hell, you would not understand either God's love or our own self-worth. And in this, we're going to try to also answer just that central objection. How could a loving God send people to hell in the first place? So, there's so many scriptures. And I don't like looking at lots of scriptures because it's almost overwhelming. So, we're going to look at just a few, and you're going to have to do a lot of study on your own. But go with me and try to stay up with some of the texts we're looking at as we look at, first of all, hell is a real place. Jesus spoke of hell more than any of the other authors in the entire Bible. First of all, if you just consider the words that are used about hell, in the Greek it's called Tartarus, and maybe you've heard that word. And we have the Bible word Hades. And in the King James, it translates the Greek word Hades into hell some 10 times. Then there's this other word called Gehenna that you might be familiar with and you might not. And so let me explain it just briefly so we have just a background. Jerusalem stood on a mount, and to the north you could travel right into this mount, but it was like a peninsula. There was a big valley on the west side, or the east side, a valley on the west side, and a valley on the south side. The south side was called the Valley of Gehenna. It was a time in the Old Testament days where people people offered their children to heathen gods. Then it became a refuge dump where people would just like any city, you have to dump your garbage somewhere. And then it became a place where poor people who had no money would throw their dead. And so the fires would burn in this dump, and once a fire gets going in a dump, you know how it is. It stinks, it smells, and it's very difficult to put that fire out. And the fires would just continually burn and its smoke would ascend. And it's a place, of course, where there's corruption because all the garbage and the dead animals and whatever, maybe even humans, there would be constant decay and corruption. And it's a place where the worm prevailed, maggots, that they would eat up the flesh. And that's just a natural occurrence in nature. And so over time, this place called Gehenna was adopted to describe the place of hell, where Jesus used it 12 times. There's 12 times it's used in the New Testament. Jesus uses all 11 of them, all but one. And it's interesting, his brother James employs the word the 12th time in James chapter 3. So those are some of the idea of the phrases that are attached to this, describe this place. And we could talk about them at length, but it's talk about a place of eternal fire. It's a furnace of fire. It's unquenchable fire. It's a lake of fire. It's outer darkness. Now, we know something about fire, don't we? It's very painful when you're burned by it. It's perhaps one of the most serious pains you can have. And I've never given birth to a child, but maybe it's right up there with it. But when he invokes the idea, metaphorically, these terms describe the reality of hell, even though there's not a literal fire. Everyone pretty much understands these are terms that are used metaphorically to describe this agony that you find yourself in hell, where this fire is unquenchable. That word means, actually in the Greek, it's the word asbestos. Isn't that interesting? Because asbestos is fire resistant. And so if you have unquenchable fire, it never goes out. It just continues to burn. And even though the fuel in our earth, our physical world, it burns up, the fire goes out, that's not the case there. It's called the lake of fire in the book of Revelation. And we'll take a peek over there. But notice how Jesus uses the term in Matthew chapter 10. When this is one of the 11 times that he uses it. He says, do not fear those who can kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. Now we learn two things here. First of all, that we are not just we are not a body, but we are a spirit living in a body. And there should not be any fear for those who can destroy the outer shell of the vehicle, but can't touch the body or the spirit, the real you. Jesus is saying to his disciples who are going to be crucified, who are going to be in arenas with lions, who are going to have to fight gladiators, who are going to be slayed open and burned at the post. So don't fear them. There's nothing to worry about that. But he said, rather fear the one who's able to destroy both soul, the real you, and your body in hell. So that's the real serious thing. One's just physical and short term, but when you're given a new body, because there will be a general resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous with a spiritual body, and you will find your home if you do not take the right choices in this place called hell that he identifies right here. And so it's a real place that Jesus warned them about, and there's many texts that talk about it. I want you to just consider the second thought, though, in Matthew 25, this is very curious. When he's talking about the parting of the sheep and the goats, this judgment scene. And he will say to those on the left, that's the goats that did not walk after him, did not share a cup of water, did not visit the sick. He says, depart from me. That's perhaps the saddest words you will ever hear. Depart. Leave from me. Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, when you consider this, you have to understand hell was not created for you and me originally. It was created for the devil and his angelic beings that serve his will. But man originally was intended to walk with God, as he did in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. Man was intended to eat of the tree of life and live forever. But because of the fall of man in the garden and the knowledge of good and evil was spilled out upon the land, man became evil in many ways. And then there was this choice. Are you going to follow God or are you going to follow yourself? And now Jesus says that watch out. Because not only the devil and his angels, which this place has been prepared for it, if you choose to follow him rather than me, you will find your abode with them. But it's not intended for us at all. It's abnormal to what the purpose of God is. And it's contrary to his will. So then why would anyone go? But hell is a real place. We have to understand that. He says in verse 46 of the same chapter, these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now the reason I show you this verse, Christians pretty much universally want to uphold the idea of heaven. That if you have faith and you follow Christ in some way, that you'll have eternal home in heaven. And so we embrace this idea of eternal life. But if you're going to accept the promise of eternal life that Jesus offers, what do you also have to accept in the same verse? There's eternal punishment. So if heaven is real, which we believe it is, and that's why we're here, then we have to accept that hell and the punishment that comes along with it is real as well. They go together. It's a real place. And people, sadly, are going to find themselves there. It's interesting when they do surveys of how many people in the United States think they're going to heaven. It's like 65 to 60% think, yeah, I'm going to heaven. And you do look at the same survey, and it's 1 to 5% of Americans think they're going to hell. Everyone thinks they're going to heaven. Everyone. Hell's not a reality to most people. They don't take it very seriously. And that's why we have to teach about it. It's a real place. And the second reason we have to talk about it, because it's a place of real torment. Now, when I say a place, you can't help but think of a place, like Disneyland or someplace. It's not a place geographically, because when God creates the heavens, the earth, there was no space or time or anything, but when he destroys in heaven and earth, all that will go away as well as time. But it is a state of torment. It's a state of torment which people will find themselves in. And it's not pleasant to talk about, but Jesus addresses it. Now there's terms to use to describe the agony that's found there. It's fiery, it's eternal, it's unquenchable. It's a place where the worm does not die, where there are chains of darkness, outer darkness, weeping and the gnashing of teeth. And then he goes on to say that, we'll look at that. But look with me in Mark chapter 9, where some of these words are employed by Jesus himself when he's talking about this, how serious it is that we walk circumspectly. He talks about in verse 42, if you cause someone to stumble, it'd be better that a millstone be hung around your neck and cast into the sea. So walk carefully. So he says in verse 43, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off, because it's better to go into eternal life crippled than to go into hell having both hands. And he says the same thing of your feet, and then he finally finishes with your eye, and that's what I want to read, verse 47 and 48. If your eye causes you to stumble, cast it out. Now we know he's speaking dramatically and figuratively, because just plucking your eye out, it's not going to cause you to stop lusting or stumbling, because you have another eye. And even blind people can lust. He's trying to talk about how serious and drastic action we got to take to make sure we avoid hell. If your eye causes you to stumble, cast it out, because then it's better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than having two eyes to be cast into hell. Notice the verb cast. Verse 48. Here's the description of this place, Gehenna. where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. These are metaphors because drawing from the picture of the valley of Gehenna where all that refuse was constantly burning, that when you look into hell, this state of agony and torment, there's two things going on. First, there is this searing pain because you're separated from God himself. And it's like a fire that burns within. And second of all, it's just a state of absolute decomposition and corruption where Jesus said, don't fear the one that can destroy just the body, but fear the one that can destroy both body and soul. The word destroy means to bring to a wreck. It doesn't mean to annihilate. So when you buy a new car, you drive it for a while, and then someone runs the stop sign and T-bones you, and your car is, what do we call it? Totaled. It still exists, but it's of no value. And in hell, things continue to deteriorate. There's no value. There's no self-worth. There's nothing. It's this corruption and decay. And that's why he says, when he talks about the idea of where the worm never dies, it's continually eating at you, and it just gets worse and worse, the state. And we'll try to describe how that happens in a second. But it's a place, he says, you don't want to be. It is so real, this place, this state called hell. Do everything you can do to avoid going there. And so it's a place, really, of torment because of one central reason. And that's found for us in this text in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Where he's talking about those who oppress Christians. God will repay them for how they have unjustly attacked his own people. In verse 8, dealing out retribution, he says, to those who do not know God and those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Remember that verse. They chose not to obey. It's very important. We'll come back to that. But to these, verse 9, he says, they will pay the penalty of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Did you get that? Eternal destruction. Why? Because they're separated from the very presence of God himself. Now, here is why I would suggest that hell is such a terrible place to be. Because you're separated from God. Remember I said that word. Notice, depart from me. In other words, leave. There's no more access to God. He said, well, why is that so terrible? In Psalms chapter 16, the psalmist David cries, thou wilt make known to me, verse 11, the path of life, the right path. In thy presence, here, listen to this, is fullness of joy. In thy right hand are the rich pleasures forever. Isn't that what we're looking for in life? To find the right path where we can get, as he calls it, the fullness of joy, that we can enjoy life to its fullest and have the richest pleasures. He says that's found in the very presence of God. In James chapter 1, the brother of Jesus says, every good and perfect gift comes down from heaven above. Because in God, there is no darkness. He is light. And if you want anything of value, of joy, it comes and it emanates from him himself. And when you're separated from that God which is light, what are you left in? But darkness. And if you're left, you're separated from every source of joy and good pleasures. If there's not pleasure, what is there? Agony. If there's not joy, what is left? These tears and cries that just constantly come up. Things we've been trying to escape. But rather than going to God, we tried to find them on our own way. And that path took us to a place we didn't want to be. So perhaps the reason why there's so much torment is, no, don't think that God's punishing and whipping people in hell. That's not our God. But it's a path we chose to take. And because it alienates us from God, all we find is misery. You say, well, I don't know if I buy into this heaven stuff, and I don't know if I buy into hell. When I die, I just want to rest from my labors. I just want to rest. It's hard. Sorry, there's no rest in hell. That's in heaven. Well, I just want to have some peace after it's all said and done. I just want to relax and have some. Sorry, that's in the peace of God, the light that comes through. There's no peace. There's just agony and turmoil. Well, I just want to have some calmness of soul and no more yelling and screaming and crying we have in the world. No, God wipes away tears. That's in heaven. It comes from a relation with Him. All you're going to have left is crying and screaming, because when you leave that which is good and you go towards that which is bad, it becomes a wreck, and it gets worse and worse and worse as it decomposes. That's the reality of hell. It's a place of torment because we are tormented by our choice and where we are. And let me just say this. When we talk about this place of torment, it's really not a matter so much of where you are, but really it's an issue of where you're not. See, the real joy is going to be in heaven or with our Father. And so if all goodness is with Him and you're separated from Him, you're separated from all that is good. So it's not so matter of an issue of where you are. Really, it's an issue of where you're not. And by default, that puts you in a terrible, terrible place. It's eternal. That's the last thing we just want to suggest. It's an eternal place that you don't want to be at. And the devil in Revelation chapter 20 is, in verse 10, is spoken of being thrown into the lake of fire, and where he'll be forever and ever. He calls that the second death in this lake of fire. At the end of that chapter, he says, anyone whose name is not written in the book of life, they will be cast into that same lake of fire. But it's interesting, that term forever and ever is also used of those who are in heaven in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 5. That these individuals, they will no longer be any need of night for them. They'll have no need of light, because the Lord God will illumine them. This is in verse 5, and they will reign forever and ever. So if we accept heaven is forever and ever, the same language is used for those who are cast in the eternal lake of fire. They will be there forever and ever. So if you understand one to be permanent, the other one is permanent as well. It's not annihilation. It's this continuous state. So when you look at that and say, wow, hell's not so a matter of where you are. It's really where you're not. So then that raises the objection that's central that we have to talk about. How could a loving God send people to hell to be punished forever and ever? Is that a fair question? Because we preach the love of God. We sang those wonderful songs. And so how could a loving God send His creation to a place of torment where they can never get out of? Why don't you just annihilate them? Wouldn't that be easier? And that's why we have to teach about hell, so people understand not only is it a real place, not only is it a place of real torment, it also is a place of judgment of choice. Now, let me explain this. This is argued and debated quite a bit in the Christian world, actually. Does God send people to hell, or do people choose to go there? There are two different camps that people sit in. They say, no, God's loving, and He would never send anyone to hell. They choose to go there. Then others say, well, no, when you say that, you ignore the language and the justice of God, because He does talk about people going to hell. And so look at the words used. And if we look at the text, it talks about being sent to hell, or thrown out, or go to hell, or cast into outer darkness, or to go away or depart. These are verbs that describe God's action about telling people, go, you're being cast into hell. So we have to accommodate those in our understanding of this idea of judgment. But there is also a choice part. Because remember, we already read in 2 Thessalonians, and I ask you to remember that. He says, For after all, it's only just. That's the idea of justice, for God to repay those who afflict you, dealing out retribution to those who do not know God and who do not obey him. Is that a choice? Is that a choice? You see, hell and how people get there is a two-sided coin. On one side, there's judgment. God is going to cast them there. The other side of the coin, there's my free will. Let me explain it like this. So a person has a problem with drinking. It could be a problem with anything, but we'll just use that. And they have a problem with alcoholism, and they just continue to drink, and they continue to try to function like everybody else who is sober. So they drive. They get a DUI. They get in an accident. No one's really hurt. But everyone's telling them, family and friends, stop it. You're going to kill someone someday, and you're going to end up in jail. All the warnings are there. And then they go, yeah, I know, a DUI, this is terrible. And, oh, yeah, I lost my job because of it. This is terrible. And they're sober for a second, but in the long term, do they know what the truth is? Do they obey the warnings that are given to them? And so their license is suspended. They choose to drive again, like many people do. And this time, they actually get in an accident and kill someone. Now they go before the judge. This happens. It plays out, doesn't it? And he looks at their record and says, look at the path you've taken. I have no choice but to sentence you now to prison for so many X years. Now, could we say they chose to go to jail? He said, no, they wouldn't say that. Could I say this? They chose the path that leads to go to jail. They chose the path. Because they knew this path would keep them out and this path would get them there, but they chose to ignore it and chose to take this path. And then the judge, when he is, that person is before them, having committed these evils against their fellow man, he has no choice but to condemn them to prison. So on the same coin, we have judgment, which is righteous, and we also have free will and choice. You know why people go to heaven? It's because they choose the path that leads to heaven. And they choose to ignore the path that leads to life. And because of that, there will come a day that God, we will stand before him, and everyone will have to give an account for the path that they took. And God will have no choice but to sentence those who chose the path leading to hell to that place that they wish to go to. You say, wow, that's tough. Is that the way it's really going to be? You know, you see, there's really just two kinds of people in the world when it comes to this issue of choosing to follow God or not. There are those who say, let thy will be done. Like Jesus said in the garden. They are willing to submit to his will and walk that path that David said in the Psalms, that where he can find the fullness of joy and the pleasures of life. But then there are the others. Now the first person says this to God. You with me? Thy will be done. The other group of people are the ones that God will say to them in the end, thy will be done. So, well, what do you mean? A common objection is the Aunt Edna objection to why God would send people to hell. So it's not original to me, but I will use it and embellish on it. We all have a grandma or an Aunt Edna. And she's the typical, wonderful, loving old lady that pays her taxes, never speeds, buckles up her seatbelt, bakes cookies for you, takes in stray cats. And so the question is it fair and loving that she should go to hell? Because she's not into this God thing. She has no use for it. But she's just this wonderful old lady. We all know someone like that. Now, is that a fair question? See, the answer really is underneath the facts of who she is. Because it presupposes that she's never had the opportunity to know God or obey God. it presupposes that she's never made the choice to turn away from him and reject him. But every person that's walked on this earth has looked in the face of God at one time or the other. Whether it's looking at a majestic mountain with the snow covering and the sun rising over it, or looking at the ocean, the sun setting, and there's this beautiful sunset, you can't help but be awe-inspired and realize there's God. Every time you hear the Christmas story, whether you celebrate his birthday or not, you are aware and familiar that there was a man named Jesus who claimed to be the Son of God. Every person, this Aunt Edna has heard this, and she's had to reflect on it, and every time she's heard it or looked in the face of God, she's had to make a choice, didn't she? She had to make a choice, will I seek him while he can be found, or I said, no, I don't want to have anything to do with you. That's what Edna did. I don't want anything to do with you. Just leave me alone. I'm not going to submit to your will, but I'm going to be in charge of my own life. Do we know a lot of people like that? Is that your own battle in your life? That, Lord, I know you're there, but just leave me alone for a while because I just want to be in charge. See, that person doesn't say, let thy will be done. That person, God will say, in the last day, let your will be done. You wanted me to leave you alone? Depart. You're on your own. You're on your own for eternity. You are so separated from me and all that is good and joyous. I'll let you have your will, your desires, and now you get to suffer the consequences of your choice. See, that's really what happens. That's how serious it is. And that leads us to our last and final point. Hell reveals God's love and our dignity. Is it right? I thought the objection is hell makes God unloving. See, what people were asking, said, well, God, if you were really loving, you wouldn't send anyone to hell. And then what they're saying, they're trying to maximize this love by getting people, make sure no one goes to hell. But in turn, really what they're doing is minimizing his love. Because when you think about it, we know love by this. And you know the scriptures, 1 John chapter 3, we know love by this, that he laid down his life for us. In John chapter 10, Jesus said, no greater friend than this, lays down his life for those his friends. Well, we all know John 3:16, God so loved the world, what? That he gave his only begotten Son, that no one should perish if they believed in him, but have eternal life. He's trying to save us from perishing in hell's fire, and it's his love that motivated that. See, you would not know God's great sacrifice. It would be meaningless if there was nothing to save us from. Isn't that not true? If it wasn't that serious and that real in the destiny of many people, then why did Christ die? See, if you erase hell and you don't send anyone there, then why do you need Christ? You don't need him. And that means his sacrifice was in vain. And rather than elevating Christ's love, or God's love, you're minimizing it. So you ask this person that objects, well, what do you want God to do? What would you have him do? He said, well, he can just forgive everyone go to heaven. He's already done that. He's made that possible. He's just asking you to come to him in faith. He said, well, I don't want to have faith. I just want to be forgiven anyway. It's not happening. Then the other thing, they might say, just let us be. Just leave us alone. God said, let thy will be done. I'll let you alone. No, our reality of hell shows how much God loves us. And also makes us realize our value to him. That of all the things in the heavens and the earth that he created, it's you that he chose to have his son die for to save. We're the most important thing to him. And it gives us motivation to live holy like him on this earth. If there is no hell, there's no accountability, there's no consequences, so we might as well just eat, drink, and be merry. And a lot of people choose to do that, don't they? Because if there's no consequences for your actions on the earth, who cares? And that's what the world teaches us right now. And Jesus has a different message. He says, be fearful. The one can cast both body and soul. You know, the real problem today is people don't fear God. And likewise, they don't fear hell. Now, I hope I kept my promise to you and I didn't yell at you. There's no hellfire and brimstone. But there will be screaming someday. And it'll be for those people that chose to ignore God and just demanded, just leave me alone. And someday, that's exactly what will happen. And that's where the screams will come from, that place of people that did not want to have anything to do with God. He said, okay. C.S. Lewis said it's insanity because those in hell lock the door from inside. Because they're just so deteriorated and they're such a wreck spiritually that when you leave God and you go down this path, you just get worse and worse and worse. That's why the worm never dies. It's this eternal fire that burns. It's the most hellish place you can imagine. But God loves you so much. He says, I sent my son to take places with you. He went to hell. He went to Hades to suffer. So if you believe in him, that you don't have to go there, that you could have eternal life. He said, I just want you to follow me. Are you persuaded? You need help? We can help you in a way once you come. So he